The transaction no one questions, what if salvation once had a price tag? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. What if forgiveness was sold, debt was spiritual, and faith operated like a marketplace complete with receipts, quotas, and revenue targets? For centuries, millions believed their eternal fate could be negotiated with money, and the most powerful institution on earth built an entire economic system around that belief. This is not just a religious story, it's a financial one. A story of incentives, debt psychology, moral leverage, and a system that collapsed under its own contradictions. This is the story of the indulgence economy when faith became transactional, setting the stage. When spiritual authority met financial reality, to understand how indulgences became an economy, we need to understand the world that produced them. Medieval Europe was not a cash-rich society. Most people lived at subsistence level. Coinage was scarce. Credit existed, but it was tightly controlled, often condemned as usury. At the same time, the Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in Europe. It controlled education, moral authority, law, and legitimacy. Kings ruled by divine sanction. The Church mediated between God and humanity, but power is expensive. Cathedrals needed building, clergy needed funding, Rome needed administration, and increasingly, the Church needed money on a scale far beyond tithes and donations. At the same time, a theological framework already existed that made monetization possible. According to church doctrine, even forgiven sins carried temporal punishment, time to be spent in purgatory. Indulgences were originally meant to reduce that time through prayer, pilgrimage, or acts of devotion. The key idea was subtle but dangerous. Guilt could be quantified, punishment could be reduced, and spiritual debt could be managed. Once debt can be measured, it can be priced. Origins from spiritual practice to financial instrument. Indulgences began as spiritual rewards. Early Christians believed acts of repentance, fasting, prayer, sacrifice could lessen time in purgatory. Over time, church authorities formalized this system. By the 11th and 12th centuries, indulgences were tied to specific actions: join a crusade, fund a church, support a holy cause. At first, money was indirect. You weren't buying forgiveness, you were financing virtue. But cause and effect began to shift. Pilgrimages required money, crusades required funding. Donations became more valuable than participation. And soon, indulgences were no longer rewards for sacrifice, they were substitutes for it. The language changed carefully. You weren't paying for forgiveness. You were contributing to the church's mission. The indulgence was merely a spiritual benefit attached. But economically, the logic was clear. Money in gives guilt reduced, gives anxiety relieved. The indulgence had become a financial instrument backed by fear. The rise scaling salvation. By the late Middle Ages, indulgences had become standardized, transferable, and scalable. This is where the system truly became an economy. Indulgences could now be purchased for oneself, purchased for deceased relatives, issued in bulk, promoted by professional sellers. Enter the indulgence preachers, men authorized to travel town to town, marketing salvation. One of the most infamous was Johann Tetzel. Tetzel didn't speak theology, he spoke psychology. He promised certainty in an uncertain world. He offered immediate relief from invisible punishment. And he used slogans simple enough to spread virally. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Behind the scenes, indulgence revenue funded massive projects, most famously, the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Here's the crucial shift. Faith was no longer the product. Assurance was. The Church had created a system where fear of damnation generated demand, authority controlled supply, money mediated the transaction. It was one of the most sophisticated monetization models of the pre-modern world. And it worked until it didn't. The breaking point when the model exposed itself. Every system built on abstraction eventually faces a credibility crisis. For indulgences, that moment came when people started asking uncomfortable questions. If forgiveness can be bought, what about the poor? If salvation has a price, who sets it? If money erases sin, what stops endless abuse? One monk in particular could no longer ignore the contradictions. Martin Luther was not trying to destroy the church, he was trying to understand it. When Luther examined indulgence theology, he saw a system that had reverse cause and effect. Repentance was no longer primary, payment was. In 1517, Luther published his 95 Theses, challenging the legitimacy of indulgences. What made this moment explosive wasn't just theology, it was timing. The printing press had just emerged. Ideas could spread faster than authority could suppress them. For the first time, the church's financial logic was publicly dissected, and people recognized something familiar: a system that monetized fear, a structure that profited from dependency, an authority that resisted transparency. The indulgence economy had overreached. Fallout: when trust collapses, the consequences were enormous. The Protestant Reformation fractured Christianity across Europe. Entire nations broke from Rome, wars followed. Political power shifted, but economically, the damage was deeper. The church lost moral monopoly, financial credibility, control over spiritual markets. Indulgences were eventually curtailed, then officially condemned. But the damage couldn't be undone. Once people realized salvation had been commodified, they began questioning other abstractions. Authority, legitimacy, value itself. Trust, once broken, does not reset easily. Failed fixes: why reform couldn't save the system. The church attempted reforms. Indulgences were redefined. Abuses were addressed. Language was softened. But the core issue remained. When an institution ties morality to transactions, incentives inevitably corrupt the message. The indulgence economy failed not because people rejected faith, but because they rejected priced faith. And yet, the model didn't disappear, it evolved. Modern parallels, different language, same mechanics today. Indulgences no longer promise salvation, but transactional morality is everywhere. Consider modern equivalents: carbon offsets that let corporations buy environmental virtue, pay to play certifications that replace actual accountability, financial penalties framed as moral absolution, debt systems that monetize anxiety about survival. The pattern is identical. Identify a fear, abstract responsibility, offer a paid mechanism for relief, scale it, normalize it. Just as indulgences transform spiritual guilt into revenue, modern systems turn existential anxiety into subscription models. And the data is staggering. Global debt exceeds $300 trillion. Entire economies operate on deferred obligation. Responsibility is abstracted, bundled, sold, and transferred. The question is no longer spiritual, it's structural. 3 takeaways: what the indulgence economy teaches us. First, when morality becomes transactional, it stops being moral. It becomes a service. Second, systems that monetize fear will always grow until trust collapses. Third, abstractions are powerful, but dangerous. Once value is detached from reality, it can be manipulated indefinitely. Warning: the question we haven't answered. The indulgence economy collapsed because people noticed the transaction. Today, many systems depend on us not noticing how responsibility is priced, not noticing how guilt is outsourced, not noticing how payment replaces accountability. The danger in belief: it's blind participation. Call to action: stay aware. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's the point. History doesn't repeat because people forget facts. It repeats because systems evolve faster than awareness. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the hidden mechanics behind money, power, and belief. And remember, whenever absolution has a price, someone is keeping the ledger.